Sometimes the ground doesn't stay silent, sometimes it waits for the right person to listen. The night air carried a quiet chill as Ethan Cole sat beneath the skeletal branches of an old oak tree, his back pressed against the rough bark, his breath drifting into the darkness in thin white clouds. The town lights glowed faintly in the distance, just far enough to remind him that he no longer belonged there, not after the door had closed behind him that morning with a finality that felt heavier than any words spoken. One duffel bag rested beside him, worn canvas stained by years of use. And next to it lay Rex, his German shepherd, 6 years old and steady as ever, his chest rising slowly, eyes half open but never truly asleep. Ethan hadn't said much since he'd been forced to leave, hadn't argued, hadn't begged, just nodded once and stepped out into the cold like a man who had already learned how quickly a place could stop being home. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the wind moved softly through the brush, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and pine, a smell that stirred something distant in his memory, something tied to summers long gone and a voice he hadn't heard in years. Rex's ears twitched first, subtle but precise, the kind of movement that came from instinct rather than curiosity, and then his head lifted, eyes locking onto a patch of darkness where the trees thickened into shadow. Ethan noticed but said nothing at first, his hand resting absently on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the coarse fur. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though Rex wasn't tense in fear, only focused, listening in a way that felt deliberate, as if the night itself had begun to speak in a language only he understood. A faint sound followed, so soft Ethan almost dismissed it, a dull, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come not from the air but from somewhere beneath the ground, spaced evenly, steady enough to feel intentional, and Rex shifted forward, rising to his feet with quiet certainty, his nose lowering toward the soil as if tracing a path invisible to human eyes. Ethan frowned, leaning forward slightly, his boots pressing into the dirt, the silence around them deepening as though the world had drawn a breath and held it. He had heard silence like this before, not peaceful, but waiting, the kind that came before something revealed itself. Rex took a few slow steps, then stopped, glancing back at Ethan with those amber eyes that carried more understanding than most people he had known, and for a moment Ethan hesitated, the weight of the day still sitting heavy in his chest. The echo of laughter from earlier ringing faintly in his ears, voices that had dismissed him, dismissed the stories his grandfather used to tell about the land behind the old property, about a place no one believed existed anymore. They had laughed when he mentioned it, called it a childhood fantasy, a cave that never was, just another story from a man who had grown too old to separate memory from imagination. Ethan had almost believed them, almost let it go. But something about the way Rex stood there now, unmoving, listening, made that doubt feel smaller, less certain. The air seemed colder near the edge of the trees, the ground softer underfoot as Ethan rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands, his gaze fixed on the place where Rex waited. The faint pulse came again, just at the edge of perception, and this time he didn't ignore it. He stepped forward, one careful step after another, following the dog into the shadowed line of trees, where the world beyond the town's reach felt older, quieter. As if it had been waiting long before he ever arrived, Rex moved with purpose now, weaving through the undergrowth, his body low, his tail steady, not the restless motion of a wandering animal but the focused stride of something that knew exactly where it was going. Ethan's heart beat a little slower as he followed, not out of fear but out of something harder to name, a pull that felt familiar and distant at the same time, like remembering a dream he hadn't thought about in years. The ground dipped slightly, and the air carried a faint mineral scent, cool and damp, and Rex stopped again, this time pressing one paw firmly against a patch of earth covered in moss and scattered stones. Ethan knelt beside him, brushing the surface with his hand, feeling the textures shift beneath his fingers, not loose dirt, but something harder, something shaped. He paused, his breath catching just slightly, as the memory surfaced fully now, his grandfather's voice, low and certain, telling him that some things weren't meant to be found quickly, that the land kept its own secrets until someone patient enough came along. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands still resting on the ground. And for the first time since the door had closed behind him that morning, something inside him shifted, not hope exactly, but the quiet sense that maybe being left with nothing wasn't the end of the story, just the place where it finally began. Rex let out a low, steady breath beside him, his gaze fixed on the earth, waiting. And this time, Ethan didn't look away. The soil gave way more easily than Ethan expected, not collapsing but shifting with a quiet reluctance as though it had been undisturbed for years, and beneath the thin layer of moss his fingers brushed against something cold and unyielding, a flat surface that did not belong to the forest. He cleared more of it with slow, deliberate movements, his breath steady despite the faint tightening in his chest, revealing the edge of what looked like metal, worn by time but unmistakably placed, not formed. Rex stood close, his posture calm but intent, nose hovering inches above the exposed surface, his ears angled forward as if listening not just to the night but to something deeper, something that pulsed beneath the barrier between them and whatever lay below. Ethan leaned closer, pressing his palm flat against the metal, and there it was again, faint but undeniable, a rhythmic vibration, spaced with a precision that felt almost mechanical, every few seconds returning like a heartbeat. Buried in the earth, he counted without meaning to, the old habit resurfacing from years of training, 1, 2, 3, until the next pulse came, steady, patient, waiting. The forest around them seemed to draw tighter, the wind easing into a hush that made every small sound sharper, the rustle of leaves, the distant creak of branches, the soft shift of Rex's paws against the ground. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and brushed away the remaining dirt until a narrow seam became visible, a thin line cutting across the metal surface as though it were part of a larger structure hidden beneath. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the faint groove, and for a moment he hesitated, the memory of his grandfather's stories pressing against his thoughts, words spoken years ago on quiet afternoons when the world had felt simpler, when secrets were told like riddles instead of warnings. There had been something about patience, about the land remembering those who listened instead of those who demanded answers, and Ethan found himself sitting back on his heels, his gaze drifting across the darkened forest as if expecting to see some sign that he was not imagining any of this. Rex broke the stillness with a soft, low sound, not a growl but something closer to a nudge, a reminder. And when Ethan looked back at him there was a quiet certainty in the dog's eyes that settled something inside him. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow cone of pale light, illuminating the metal plate more clearly now, revealing faint markings along its edge, symbols worn almost smooth but still present enough to suggest intention. They were not random, not natural, but part of something built, something meant to be found only by someone willing to look closely. Ethan traced one of the marks with his thumb, feeling the indentation, and a faint memory surfaced, a shape he had seen before, carved into an old piece of wood his grandfather used to keep on the mantel, a symbol he had never understood at the time but had never forgotten either. The realization settled slowly, not as a sudden shock but as a quiet alignment of pieces that had been scattered across years, and he felt a small, steady shift inside him, like a door opening just enough to let light through. He positioned his fingers along the seam and applied pressure, testing it, and at first nothing happened, the metal holding firm as though resisting, but then, with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, the edge lifted slightly. Just enough to break the seal that had held it in place for who knew how long. Ethan paused, his hand resting on the surface, his heartbeat echoing faintly in his ears as he glanced at Rex, who remained still, watching, waiting, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Carefully, slowly, Ethan pulled upward, the metal plate shifting with a low, drawn-out sound, revealing darkness beneath, not empty but deep. A space that swallowed the light rather than reflected it. A cool breath of air rose from the opening, carrying with it a scent that was different from the forest above, older, tinged with stone and something metallic, something preserved. Ethan leaned closer, angling the flashlight downward, the beam stretching into the opening but not reaching the bottom, only catching glimpses of rough surfaces and what looked like the suggestion of a narrow descent. He felt a strange calm settle over him then, not excitement, not fear, but a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it had not been placed here by accident, and it had not revealed itself by chance. Rex stepped forward, placing one paw carefully at the edge of the opening, peering down with focused attention before glancing back at Ethan, his expression almost questioning, as if asking whether they were ready to continue. Ethan let out a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and for the first time since he had been forced out into the night, he felt something close to direction, not given to him, not handed over, but discovered step by step in the quiet space between doubt and belief. He adjusted the light in his hand, his gaze fixed on the darkness below, and moved a little closer, knowing without fully understanding why that whatever lay beneath them had been waiting far longer than he had been searching, and that some paths did not begin until everything else had been taken away. The opening breathed out a steady chill as Ethan lowered himself closer to its edge, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path into the darkness below, revealing the first few feet of what appeared to be a sloped passage carved not by chance but by intention, the walls smooth in places and rough in others. As if shaped by both hand and time, Rex moved first, as he always did when certainty outweighed hesitation, placing his front paws onto the incline and testing the surface before stepping down with careful balance, his nails clicking faintly against stone that had not heard footsteps in years. Ethan followed more slowly, gripping the edge of the opening for support before easing himself down, his boots finding purchase against the angled floor as he descended into the cool silence, the air growing denser with each step, carrying a mineral weight that settled into his lungs. The world above seemed to fade quickly, the forest sounds dimming until only the quiet echo of his own movements remained, accompanied by the soft, steady breathing of the dog ahead of him. The passage narrowed slightly as it curved, the ceiling low enough in places that Ethan instinctively ducked, his shoulders brushing against cold stone that felt solid and unmoving, as though it had been standing guard long before he was born. The faint rhythmic pulse returned, stronger now, no longer something he had to search for but something that seemed to surround him, vibrating through the ground and into his bones with a pattern that felt deliberate, almost guiding. Rex paused halfway down the slope, turning his head back briefly, his eyes reflecting the beam of light with a quiet alertness, and then he continued, drawn forward by something Ethan could not yet see. When the passage finally opened, it did so without warning, widening into a chamber that forced Ethan to stop for a moment just to take it in, the beam of his flashlight sweeping slowly across the space, revealing walls reinforced with aged timber supports and sections of stone that had been cut cleanly, too precise to be natural. This was not a simple cave, not the kind children imagined when they spoke of hidden places, but something constructed, something planned. The floor leveled out beneath his boots, and he stepped forward. Cautiously, the sound of each movement echoing softly in the chamber, returning to him a fraction of a second later as if the space itself were listening. Rex moved along the perimeter, nose close to the ground, tracing unseen paths, occasionally stopping to focus on a specific spot before moving again, his behavior calm but purposeful, like a guide retracing a route he had always known. Ethan directed the light toward the far wall, where something caught his attention, a shape that broke the uniform texture of stone, rectangular and partially obscured by time, and as he approached, the details became clearer, a structure embedded into the wall, framed with metal that had dulled but not rusted away completely. He reached out, brushing his fingers across its surface, feeling the faint grooves of a handle or latch, and the same symbol he had seen above appeared again, worn but unmistakable, carved into the corner as a quiet signature left behind. His breath slowed as the realization deepened, not as a sudden revelation but as a growing understanding that this place had been more than a story. More than an old man's fading memory. It had been real all along, hidden not because it was lost, but because it was meant to be. The faint pulse continued, now clearer than ever, and Ethan noticed that it seemed to originate from beyond the structure, deeper still, as if whatever lay behind it was the true source. Rex stood beside him now, his body still, his ears forward, his gaze fixed on the same point, waiting not with urgency but with quiet expectation. Ethan adjusted his grip on the flashlight, angling it to better see the edges of the embedded door, the way it sat flush against the surrounding stone, sealed not by decay but by design, and he felt a moment of hesitation rise within him, not fear, but the weight of crossing a threshold that could not be undone. Above him, the world he had known had already closed its doors, leaving him with nothing but the path ahead, and down here, in the stillness beneath the earth, something else had opened, something patient and enduring. He placed his hand firmly against the handle, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm, and glanced once at Rex, who met his gaze with the same steady calm he had carried through every uncertain step, as if to say that some journeys were not meant to be questioned once they began. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the air cool and grounding, and as he prepared to pull, the quiet thought settled into place, clear and undeniable, that whatever his grandfather had left behind was not just a secret, but a choice waiting to be made by the one who found it. The metal handle resisted at first, not with force but with a quiet stiffness that spoke of years without movement, and Ethan tightened his grip, drawing a slow breath before pulling again, this time with steady pressure instead of urgency, and the door responded with a low, drawn-out shift, the sound echoing softly through the chamber like a memory being stirred awake. A thin line of darkness widened into an opening, and with it came a deeper breath of air, cooler and heavier, carrying a scent that felt untouched by time, as if the space beyond had been sealed not just from the world, but from its passing. Rex stepped forward without hesitation, lowering his head slightly as he crossed the threshold, his body relaxed but alert, trusting the path ahead in a way that made Ethan follow despite the quiet weight building in his chest. The beam of the flashlight moved with him, revealing a narrow corridor that extended inward, its walls more refined than the outer chamber, reinforced with old wooden beams that had aged but held firm, and along the sides, faint outlines of shelves or compartments emerged, carved directly into the stone as though someone had shaped this place with intention and patience rather than haste. Ethan moved slowly, each step deliberate, his boots brushing against a thin layer of dust that had settled undisturbed, and yet the air did not feel abandoned, not empty, but preserved. As if the silence here had purpose, the rhythmic pulse continued, stronger. Now, no longer distant but present, vibrating subtly through the floor and into his stance, guiding rather than warning, and he found himself matching its pace unconsciously, his breathing aligning with its steady interval. Rex paused again, this time beside one of the carved recesses in the wall, his nose close to the surface, tracing its edges before stepping aside, and Ethan angled the light toward it, revealing objects that had been carefully placed, not scattered or forgotten, but arranged with quiet precision. Small containers, sealed and intact, rested within the stone, their surfaces worn but preserved, and beside them, a folded piece of cloth, its color faded but still holding form, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the cloth, feeling its texture. And for a moment he hesitated, the sense that he was not just uncovering something, but stepping into a story that had been paused rather than ended. The memory of his grandfather returned, not as a clear image, but as a feeling, a presence that lingered in the way the place had been built, and the care taken to preserve what lay within. He unfolded the cloth carefully, revealing a simple object wrapped inside, something small and solid, and as he lifted it, the light caught its surface, showing a worn emblem etched into its face, the same symbol that had marked the entrance above. Repeated here as a quiet confirmation that this place belonged to a design larger than a single moment, Rex let out a soft breath beside him, settling briefly as if acknowledging the discovery before rising again, his attention already shifting deeper into the corridor, toward the source of the pulse that had not ceased. Ethan replaced the object gently, returning it to its place. Not out of disinterest but out of an instinct he did not question, a sense that not everything needed to be taken to be understood. He moved forward again, following Rex as the corridor widened slightly, the ceiling lifting just enough to ease the pressure of the enclosed space, and ahead, a faint glow began to appear, not bright, not artificial, but a subtle reflection of light that suggested an opening beyond. The pulse grew more distinct, no longer just a vibration but a presence, something that marked time in a way that felt intentional. Almost like a signal waiting to be answered, Ethan slowed his steps, the beam of the flashlight lowering slightly as he approached the source of the glow, and the corridor opened into another chamber, larger than the first, its walls lined with structures that hinted at purpose, not random formation but careful construction, each element placed with thought. In the center of the space, something stood that drew his focus immediately, A form that interrupted the symmetry of the room, not large but significant, and as he stepped closer, the details began to take shape, edges catching the light, surfaces reflecting it back in muted tones. Rex stopped at the edge of the chamber, his body still, his gaze fixed forward, waiting not with tension but with recognition, as if they had reached the place he had sensed from the beginning. Ethan paused beside him, the quiet of the chamber settling around them, the pulse steady beneath their feet, and for a moment he did not move, allowing the weight of the space to settle, the realization that this was not a forgotten corner of the world, but something deliberately hidden, something meant to endure until it was found by the right hands. He lifted the flashlight slightly, the beam steady now, and took a final step forward, understanding without needing explanation that whatever lay at the center of this place was not just part of his grandfather's past, but something that would shape what came next. The object at the center of the chamber did not reveal itself all at once, but slowly, as Ethan stepped closer and allowed the beam of his flashlight to settle, the shape resolving into something deliberate and unmistakably human-made, a structure rising waist-high from the stone floor, framed in dark metal and reinforced with thick panels that had weathered time without surrendering to it. It was not ornate, not decorative, but purposeful, built with the quiet efficiency of someone who valued function over display, and at its front, set into the surface with careful precision, was a panel marked again with the same worn symbol that had followed him from the entrance to this place, repeating like a signature left across decades. Rex moved no further, stopping just short of the structure, his posture composed, his attention fixed forward as though he had reached the end of a path he had been tracing since the moment they entered the forest, and Ethan felt that stillness settle into him as well. The kind that did not demand action but invited understanding. The pulse beneath his feet was strongest here, steady and unbroken, resonating through the chamber with a quiet authority that seemed less like a sound and more like a presence, something that marked time in its own measured way. Ethan circled the structure slowly, his light revealing more details along its sides, small vents, reinforced seams, and along one edge, a narrow slot that looked almost like a place where something could be inserted or retrieved, though nothing was immediately visible within it. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the surface before finally making contact, the metal cool and smooth beneath his palm, and as he did, the faint vibration seemed to respond, not changing in rhythm but becoming more noticeable, as if acknowledging the connection. For a moment he simply stood there, his hand resting against it, his breath slow, his thoughts quieter than they had been in a long time, and in that silence, something shifted, not outside of him but within, a sense that he was not just uncovering a hidden place, but stepping into a role that had been waiting for him without his knowledge. Rex exhaled softly, the sound grounding, and Ethan glanced down at him before returning his attention to the panel, noticing now a small indentation near the symbol, subtle enough to be overlooked at a glance, but shaped with intention. He pressed against it gently, testing, and at first nothing happened, but then there was a soft internal click, followed by a faint release of pressure beneath his hand, the structure responding not with noise but with quiet cooperation. A seam along the top edge shifted slightly, opening just enough to reveal a narrow compartment within, and as Ethan leaned in, the light illuminated its contents, a single object resting at the center, wrapped in a protective layer that had preserved it against time. He reached in carefully, lifting it with both hands, the weight surprising but not overwhelming, and as he unwrapped the outer layer, the object beneath came into view, a compact case, reinforced and sealed, its surface marked with the same emblem that had guided him here, but clearer now, less worn, as if this piece had been protected more deliberately than the rest. Ethan studied it for a moment, turning it slightly in the light, noticing the precision of its design, the way every edge seemed to fit together with purpose, and a quiet realization began to form, not fully shaped but present enough to feel, that this was not something left behind carelessly, but something entrusted. The pulse continued beneath them, steady and unwavering, and for the first time, Ethan understood that it was not random, not environmental, but connected to what he now held, part of a system that had been set in place long before he arrived. Rex stepped closer now, his nose brushing lightly against Ethan's arm, as if confirming the significance of the object, his eyes calm, steady, and Ethan felt a faint, unexpected warmth rise in his chest, not excitement, not triumph, but something quieter, a sense of being chosen not by chance, but by alignment. He looked back toward the chamber, taking in the space once more, the careful construction, the preserved elements, the silence that felt less like emptiness and more like intention held in place, and he realized that whatever this was, whatever his grandfather had built or hidden here, it had never been about being found quickly or easily. It had been about being found by someone who would not dismiss it, someone who would listen. Someone who would follow a path even when others laughed. Ethan adjusted his grip on the case, holding it securely as he stepped back from the structure, the light shifting with him, casting long shadows across the chamber walls, and as he turned slightly toward Rex, who stood ready at his side, he felt that quiet certainty settle deeper within him, the understanding that what he carried was not just an object, but a beginning, and that some legacies did not arrive with explanation. They revealed themselves only to those willing to walk into the dark and trust what they found waiting there. The weight of the case in Ethan's hands felt different now that he had stepped away from the structure, not heavier in a physical sense but steadier, as if it carried a kind of balance that extended beyond its size, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the quiet of the chamber settle around him, while the faint rhythmic pulse continued beneath his boots, no longer mysterious but connected, as though the object he held and the place he stood within were part of the same living system. Rex remained close, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg. A grounding presence that reminded him he was not alone in this space, and when Ethan finally shifted his gaze back toward the corridor they had entered from, there was no urgency in the movement, only a quiet understanding that this was not the end of the path, only the first piece revealed. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, placing the flashlight carefully on the ground so that its beam angled upward, casting a soft, steady light across the case, and with deliberate care, he turned it in his hands, examining its edges. The seams, the way each component fit together with a precision that suggested it had been crafted with intention rather than convenience. Along one side, nearly invisible unless caught at the right angle, he noticed a narrow groove that ran the length of the surface, and as his fingers traced it, the faintest click sounded beneath his touch, subtle but distinct enough to confirm that the case was not sealed permanently, but waiting. Ethan paused, his hand resting there. The memory of his grandfather returning again, not in words this time, but in the feeling of being watched over without pressure, guided without force, and he realized that whatever this moment required of him, it was not haste, but patience. He applied gentle pressure along the groove, and the case responded with a soft release, the top panel shifting just enough to separate from the base, revealing a thin line of shadow between them, and as he lifted it slowly, the interior came into view, illuminated by the angled beam of the flashlight. Inside, there was no clutter, no collection of scattered items, but a single, carefully arranged set of contents, each placed with precision as though their meaning depended not just on their presence, but on their order. A folded document rested at the center, its edges protected by a transparent covering that had preserved it against time, and beside it, a small metallic object, compact and unfamiliar, its surface etched with fine lines that mirrored the emblem he had seen repeated throughout the cave. Ethan reached first for the document, lifting it carefully, feeling the slight resistance of the protective layer before it gave way, and as he unfolded it, the paper beneath revealed markings that were still clear despite their age, lines and symbols arranged in a pattern that was both structured and complex, not random notes, but something closer to a map, though not of land in the traditional sense. His eyes moved slowly across it, tracing the paths, the intersections, the markings that seemed to correspond not to roads or rivers, but to something hidden beneath the surface, a network that extended beyond the chamber they stood in, reaching outward in ways he could not yet fully understand. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his gaze moving between Ethan and the open case, attentive without distraction, as if aware that this moment carried weight beyond what could be seen. Ethan lowered the document slightly, his thoughts aligning with a quiet clarity that had been building since the moment they found the entrance, and for the first time, he understood that this was not simply a discovery of something valuable, but the uncovering of something purposeful. Something that had been placed here not to be taken, but to be continued. He returned his attention to the case, his gaze settling briefly on the small metallic object still resting inside, its surface catching the light in subtle reflections, and though he did not yet reach for it, he felt its presence as part of the same system, a piece that would matter when the time was right. The pulse beneath the ground remained steady, unchanged. But now it felt less like a mystery and more like a signal that had finally been received. Ethan folded the document carefully, returning it to its place within the case, not out of hesitation, but out of a growing sense that understanding would come step by step, not all at once. He closed the case gently, the panels aligning with a soft click that echoed faintly in the chamber, and as he rose to his feet, holding it securely once more, the space around him seemed to shift, not physically, but in the way it was perceived, no longer an unknown environment, but a place with meaning, a place that had revealed just enough to invite him further. Rex stepped forward, turning his head slightly toward the corridor, as if ready to lead the next part of the journey, and Ethan followed his gaze, the path ahead no longer uncertain, but open in a way that felt deliberate. He took a slow breath, the cool air steady in his lungs, and with the case held firmly in his grasp, he understood that what he carried was not just an inheritance, but a direction, something that would not be explained in words, but discovered in the choices he made from this point on. The corridor seemed different as Ethan turned back toward it, not in shape or structure, but in the way it held his attention, as if the space itself had shifted from something hidden into something that acknowledged his presence. And with the case secured in his hands, he followed Rex as the dog began moving forward again with quiet certainty, his steps measured, his ears angled slightly as though still listening to something deeper than sound. The faint rhythmic pulse continued beneath them, unchanged in tempo yet somehow clearer, as though its purpose had shifted from calling to guiding, and Ethan found himself walking in rhythm with it, each step aligning unconsciously with the steady interval that echoed through the stone. The beam of his flashlight traced along the corridor walls as they moved, revealing details he had not noticed before, small markings etched into the surface at regular intervals. Subtle enough to be missed at first glance, but consistent enough to suggest intention, like a path marked not for the many, but for the one who knew how to see. Rex slowed near one of these markings, pausing briefly to press his nose against the stone before moving on, and Ethan followed more closely now, his eyes scanning the walls, recognizing the pattern, the repetition of the same emblem that had guided them from the entrance, each one placed at a precise height and distance, forming a silent trail through the underground passage. The air felt slightly warmer as they advanced, less heavy than before, carrying a faint dryness that contrasted with the damp mineral scent of the earlier chambers, and ahead, the corridor began to slope upward, gradually at first, then more noticeably, as if leading them toward another threshold. Ethan adjusted his grip on the case, feeling its steady presence against his palms, and though he had not yet opened it again, the awareness of what it contained lingered in his thoughts, not as a distraction, but as a quiet reminder that the journey was unfolding in stages, each step revealing only what was needed. Rex reached the incline first, climbing with ease, his body balanced and confident, and when he reached the top, he stopped, turning his head slightly as if waiting for Ethan to catch up before proceeding. The flashlight beam shifted as Ethan followed, illuminating a narrow opening at the end of the passage framed by stone that looked less worn than the rest, as though it had been reinforced more recently, though time had blurred any clear distinction. The pulse beneath his feet softened slightly as he approached, not fading, but changing in intensity, becoming less dominant, as if they were moving away from its source, and in its place, another sensation began to emerge, not a sound, but a stillness. A kind of quiet that felt intentional rather than empty. Rex stepped through the opening first, his body lowering slightly as he crossed the threshold, and Ethan followed, the beam of light expanding into a new space that was smaller than the previous chamber, but no less deliberate in its construction. The walls here were smoother, the angles more defined, and along one side, a narrow ledge extended the length of the room, holding a series of objects that had been placed with careful spacing, each one preserved in a way that suggested they were meant to be seen, not hidden. Ethan moved closer, the light revealing their shapes, small containers, tools, and fragments of something that hinted at work done long ago, not abandoned, but paused. Rex remained near the center of the room, his attention shifting between the objects and the far wall, where another feature began to take shape in the light, a vertical surface that differed from the rest, smoother, darker, and marked with lines that intersected in a pattern that felt familiar. Ethan approached slowly, his steps quiet against the stone, and as he drew closer, the pattern resolved into something unmistakable. A larger version of the markings he had seen on the document within the case, lines and symbols arranged in a structure that mirrored what he had briefly studied, only here they were fixed into the wall itself, not drawn, but embedded. He felt a subtle shift within him as the connection formed, not a sudden realization, but a deepening understanding that this place was not just a single hidden chamber, but part of a larger design, one that extended beyond what he could see in this moment. The case in his hands felt heavier now, not from weight, but from meaning, and he lowered it slightly, his gaze moving between it and the wall, sensing that the two were connected in ways he had yet to fully grasp. Rex stepped closer to the wall, his nose tracing along one of the intersecting lines before stopping at a specific point, his posture still, his attention fixed as if waiting for Ethan to follow. Ethan moved beside him, lifting the flashlight to illuminate the exact spot, and there, at the intersection of several lines, was another small indentation, nearly identical to the one on the case, subtle but precise. He hesitated for only a moment, the quiet of the room pressing gently around him, and then he shifted the case in his hands, aligning it instinctively with the marking on the wall, the motion not forced, but guided by the pattern itself. As the two surfaces met, there was a faint, almost imperceptible click, followed by a soft change in the air. A subtle movement that suggested something within the structure had responded. Ethan held still, his breath slow, his focus steady, and in that moment he understood that this was not a place meant to be taken apart or claimed, but a system meant to be engaged, step, by someone willing to follow it without rushing. Rex remained beside him, calm and unwavering, and together they stood in the quiet chamber, the next part of the path beginning to reveal itself not through force, but through alignment. The moment the case aligned with the indentation on the wall, the chamber seemed to respond not with noise but with a subtle shift in presence, as though something long dormant had recognized a pattern completed, and Ethan felt it first through his hands, a faint vibration passing from the surface of the wall into the case, and then into his grip, steady and controlled, like a signal acknowledging its match. Rex stood completely still beside him, his body relaxed but attentive, his eyes fixed on the point of contact as if he had been waiting for this exact moment since they first stepped beneath the earth. The lines etched into the wall began to change almost imperceptibly, not moving in a visible mechanical way, but reflecting the light differently, as though the surface itself had awakened, revealing deeper layers within the pattern, lines intersecting with greater clarity, forming a structure that extended beyond what the eye could immediately follow. Ethan did not pull the case away, something in him understanding that this was not a trigger to activate and then release, but a connection to maintain, and as he held it steady, the faint rhythmic pulse that had guided them began to shift, its steady beat softening and stretching, as if the system beneath the ground was adjusting to a new state. A low hum emerged, not loud or disruptive, but present enough to be felt more than heard, resonating gently through the chamber walls and into the air around them, and with it came a subtle change in light, a faint glow tracing along the etched lines on the wall, following their paths outward like veins carrying something unseen. Ethan's breath slowed as he watched, the moment unfolding with a quiet certainty that felt less like discovery and more like confirmation, as if everything that had led him here had been part of a sequence already set in motion long before he understood it. Rex took a single step back. Not in retreat but in adjustment, giving Ethan space, while maintaining his focus on the wall, his ears slightly angled as though listening to the hum beneath the surface. The glow intensified just enough to reveal a section of the wall that had previously blended into the surrounding stone, a panel defined not by edges alone but by the way the light traced its outline, and as the hum deepened slightly, the panel responded, shifting inward with a smooth, controlled motion that carried no strain, no resistance, only the quiet precision of something built to last. Ethan felt the case in his hands grow slightly warmer, not hot, but alive with a subtle energy that mirrored the changes in the wall, and he instinctively loosened his grip just enough to allow the connection to complete, and with a final soft click, the indentation released, the case no longer fixed to the surface, yet the system continued its motion as though it no longer required the contact to proceed. The panel slid open fully now, revealing a hidden compartment beyond, not deep, but carefully constructed, its interior illuminated by the same faint glow that traced the lines across the wall, and within it, arranged with the same deliberate care Ethan had seen throughout the cave, were a series of items that immediately shifted the weight of everything he thought he understood. There were documents, preserved and layered, their edges sealed against time, alongside them a set of instruments. Not modern in appearance but crafted with a level of precision that suggested they were designed for a specific purpose, and at the center, placed with unmistakable intention, was a larger version of the emblem, not etched or worn, but intact, its lines sharp, its form complete, as though it represented the whole of what had been scattered in fragments throughout the space. Ethan stepped closer, lowering the case slightly as his attention fixed on the contents, and for a moment he did not reach out. Did not disturb the arrangement, understanding now that this was not simply a collection of hidden valuables, but a system of knowledge, a continuation of something his grandfather had not abandoned, but entrusted to time. The realization settled into him slowly, not as a shock, but as a quiet unfolding, that this place had never been about wealth in the way others would define it, but about preservation, about carrying forward something that required patience, understanding, and the willingness to see beyond what was immediately visible. Rex moved closer again, his presence steady, his gaze shifting between Ethan and the open compartment, as if confirming that the path they had followed had led exactly where it was meant to. The hum beneath the chamber softened, the glow along the walls dimming gradually as the system completed its response, leaving the space once again in stillness, though it no longer felt dormant, but aware, as if it had acknowledged Ethan not just as a visitor, but as someone now part of its design. Ethan lifted his eyes from the compartment to the wall, then to the case in his hands, and then finally to Rex, whose calm presence had guided him without question. And in that quiet moment, standing between what had been hidden and what had been revealed, he understood that this was not the end of a mystery, but the beginning of a responsibility, one that could not be measured in value, but only in the choices that would follow. The chamber settled into a deeper silence as the faint glow along the walls faded completely, leaving only the steady beam of Ethan's flashlight and the quiet presence of the space around him, and for a long moment he did not move, standing there with the case in his hands and the open compartment before him, allowing everything he had seen and felt to find its place within him. Rex shifted slightly at his side, lowering himself onto the cool stone floor with a calm, watchful posture, his breathing slow and even, as though he understood that this moment did not require urgency, only stillness. Ethan stepped closer to the compartment once more, his movements measured, and this time he reached out, not with hesitation but with quiet respect, lifting one of the preserved documents from its place, the material firm beneath his fingers, protected against time yet carrying the weight of years within its lines. He did not unfold it fully, not yet, but he could see enough to recognize that what lay before him was not a single record or a simple map, but a continuation of what he had already begun to understand, a network of knowledge, carefully maintained and intentionally hidden, not for secrecy alone, but for preservation until it could be carried forward. He returned the document gently, placing it back exactly as he had found it, and stepped back, his gaze moving slowly across the contents of the compartment, the instruments, the markings, the emblem that now felt less like a symbol and more like a key to something larger than himself. The quiet realization settled deeper within him, steady and undeniable, that this place had not been built for discovery in the way most would expect, not for wealth or recognition, but for continuity, for the passing of something that could not be explained in a single moment, only lived through over time. Rex rose again as Ethan turned slightly away from the compartment, his ears flicking once as if sensing the shift in direction. And together they began to move back toward the corridor, not in retreat, but in completion of this part of the journey. The path felt familiar now, the markings along the walls no longer hidden but understood, guiding them with quiet certainty as they retraced their steps through the passage, the air gradually changing as they moved upward, growing lighter, carrying the faint scent of the forest waiting above. The rhythmic pulse that had guided them from the beginning softened with each step, not disappearing entirely, but fading into the background like a heartbeat no longer needed to be followed, and Ethan felt that change as a quiet confirmation that the system beneath the ground had completed its purpose for now. When they reached the first chamber, he paused briefly, glancing once more at the space that had revealed itself to him, the structure at its center now still and silent, as though it had returned to rest. Waiting again for the next moment it would be needed, Rex moved ahead toward the incline, his steps steady, and Ethan followed, climbing back toward the opening, the cool air of the cave giving way to the crisp breath of night as they emerged once more into the forest. The sky above stretched wide and clear, stars scattered across it like distant points of quiet light, and the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying a softness that felt different now, less empty, more alive. Ethan stood there for a moment, the case still in his hands, the weight of it no longer uncertain, but understood, not as something to claim, but something to carry. Rex settled beside him, his body close, his presence constant. And together they looked out toward the dark outline of the land beyond, the town lights faint in the distance, no longer a place of belonging, but no longer something that defined him either. The path ahead was not clear in detail, not mapped out in simple terms, but it did not need to be, because for the first time since everything had been taken from him, Ethan felt something steady beneath his feet, not the ground itself, but a sense of direction that did not depend on where he stood, but on what he chose to do next. He adjusted his grip on the case, holding it securely, and turned slightly, stepping away from the opening without looking back, not out of disregard, but out of trust that what needed to be found again would be there when the time was right. The forest accepted them quietly, the path beneath their feet soft with fallen leaves, and as they moved forward together, the night no longer felt like an ending, but like the beginning of something that did not need to be explained to be understood. And somewhere beneath the earth, far below where the roots of the trees held their place, the system rested once more, not closed, not forgotten, but waiting, as it always had, for the one who would carry its purpose forward without needing to be told why.